Hello, everyone. Welcome to part three of the six-part series, Colorism in the Workplace. I'm Dr. Sarah Webb, your host for this series. And today I'm joined by a very special guest. I'll introduce her in just a second. But first, I'd like to know if you all can hear us, if you can see us okay. And if so, please let us know in the chat. I like interactive live, so we will be taking questions throughout this live stream. If you have questions about colorism, as well as comments, if you have a comment, if you have an experience that you've witnessed or that you've had yourself when it comes to colorism in the workplace, all that we will be engaging with you all in the chat as we go. And to start off with, you can let us know where you're watching from. If you are watching, if you are joining us, let us know where you're tuning in from. So as I mentioned, this is part three in a six-part series. Be sure to go and check out the previous two episodes I did with Dr. Crutchfield and Dr. Anderson. And next week, I will be joined by Aliette Murray-Drobat to talk about colorism and company culture. So mark your calendars for that. And today, we're talking about colorism in hiring, income, and wealth. And so my guest today is Dr. Akosua. Hello, how are you doing today?
Hey, I just had to unmute. I'm doing well. How are you, Sarah?
Good. I know. It's always good to talk to you. I feel like your energy, your vibe is so great. So I'm excited that my audience gets to, witness that and experience that, as well as all of your insights. And you just be on point. I love talking to
Oh,
you.
thank you.
Yes. So let's start off by telling us who you are. And that way, anyone who's watching live or anyone who's watching the recording or the playback, they get a sense of your context. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. So I'm an educator. I started my career as a high school social studies teacher in my hometown of Broward County, Florida. And I matriculated through my educational career into educational leadership. And I now have an educational design firm as well as a nonprofit that focuses on the health, well-being, and legacy of Black women educators, and also recruiting Black educators in general. So I am a pre-K through 16 educator. That's who I am. Yeah,
Yes.
people think I talk about colorism all the time. I don't. It's just my, and if I did, that would be fine. But yeah, so I'm in the field of education and focused on educational equity for Black children and recruiting Black teachers, because Black teachers make up less than 7% of the teaching force. Right now, 82% of all school teachers are white, mostly women,
Mhm.
and 80% of all school principals are white, which is not good for democracy.
Ooh.
Not good for democracy, not
Yes.
good for Black children, not good for the future of this nation.
Not good for the future of this nation, right?
No, no.
And it's interesting because even though we focused on colorism in education last week,
Mhm.
that's one of the things that I brought up, is that when we look at disparities in education based on skin tone, realizing that a lot of these disparities are being created and perpetuated by white teachers in the classroom, by white administrators, by white school officials.
Mhm.
And I think you stating that data, stating those numbers really brings it home
Yeah,
that, colorism is not something that only happens within Black spaces, but that it
correct.
happens in all spaces, right? And that,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of like just your professional experience in general,
Mhm.
because you do have a lot of work experience for yourself as an employee, but also then
Mhm.
rising up through the ranks and
Mhm.
being a leader in different organizations, but even like professional spaces that are adjacent to the workplace. So like a conference or, a
Mhm.
seminar or workshop. Have
Mhm.
you seen, observed, or experienced colorism in any way in a professional setting?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you mentioned sort of the latter part of my career where I progressed into leadership. And I think that that's where I started to notice it the most.
Mhm.
As you know, my personal story, I didn't start talking about colorism publicly until I was 40. And that's because I was in a relationship with a dyed-in-the-wool colorist. And just part of processing that trauma, processing, all of that stuff. So part of my beginning to speak publicly was me just working through that stuff, right? And so I don't know if that's why I didn't notice it. I think it's possible that didn't notice it also because colorism has everything to do with how quickly and how far you rise as well. So as I rose up, I definitely noticed it. And so I'm going to try to share very quickly. So I have lots of anecdotes. One is that, just like my organization, which is Sisters in Education Circle, we gather Black women. So there are a lot of gathering spaces and healing spaces for Black women. So there might be like a professional gathering for Black women, or if you're in a particular city, Black women educator leaders in that particular city. And so as I began to be invited into these spaces, like I noticed, like the higher up I went, the lighter the room was, right? And so it was not uncommon for me to be the only dark-skinned Black woman in the space, right? And so I began to, I'm like, this is crazy. And what's crazy about it to me is that, and I make this assertion, I definitely would love for a demographer or human geographer or geographer, to check in about it. But most Black people have brown skin. So I'm not talking about this whole, like this phrasing that we talk about Black and brown people, because somehow when we talk about these brown people, we're still including people whose skin is not brown, right? And so most Black people in the world have brown, right, to dark brown or jet black skin. But when you talk about representation, especially in upper echelons, somehow we get lighter. And somehow, right? We know how and why, but somehow the room gets lighter and lighter. And so that's just weird to me. So it just struck me as like, how in these circles that are supposed to be for Black women, supposed to be for Black women leaders, supposed to be these spaces of encouragement and pro-Blackness, right? Because these spaces are always super pro-Black. And I'm like, how am I the only dark-skinned Black woman? This is everyone in here is a Black woman. How am I the only or one of very few? And even if it's more than a few of us, we're the minority.
Right.
And so I was like, this is not right. This is not cool. And then two other anecdotes that I'll try to share very quickly. So there's a particular school district that I worked in that absolutely has a race problem. And you and I have talked about, right? That colorism is a part of how the white power structure expresses itself, right? Yeah, so absolutely. Everyone, whether they're Black or white or, Asian or Native American, who's expressing colorism is really carrying the water for the white power structure, right? That's the root of it. So whenever you find a race problem, you're gonna find a color problem. And so I worked at this school district that absolutely has a race problem, right? As far as disproportionately white people leading the district, white folks having higher salaries, having more opportunities, white people being the predominant, force of leaders. And I remember because you and I have talked about how dark-skinned Black women in particular are silenced almost from utero about talking about colorism, right? Yeah. And so part of my healing process has been breaking that silence, like realizing that that I have been silenced, and that it is like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like when it's like subconscious, right? It's a part. And so being conscious about breaking that silence. But what that means is that sometimes I don't trust my observations, right? Or I ignore them, because anytime I would bring them up before, people would say, oh no, that's not happening, or it's not a big deal. So I had been working, at this district, and noticed, right? So not only was I one of very few Black people at that level, but the more I interacted with offices and people in higher positions than even my particular position, it was like all light skin, some biracial, some not, but very much that aesthetic, right? Of light-skinned Black folks.
Mhm.
And so, it was like that kind of like creak that you hear in the night. You're like, okay, I feel like this is a thing. But again, that reflex of being silenced around it. And then there was another black male leader, in my division. And he and I became friends, which is it's a very interesting story because he could be considered light skinned. I mean, I didn't look at him and be like, oh my gosh, he's light skinned. Like he identified himself as light skinned. And he actually had said that he was very surprised that I was so open and embracing to him because he gets from a lot, and we know how colorism manifests itself among men, right? So he gets a lot of that, you're not black, you're not tough. That's what he said. And so he was surprised that I was open to him and just identified him as another black colleague. It could be because there were only two of us on the floor, so I was like, this is a black man. I'm attaching myself to you as a black man until you say otherwise. But it was him who just said to me randomly, do you notice? Because my department was a department that had to interact with folks at all levels. Like we service schools, but we also service folks higher up than we.
Mhm.
And so he said, do you notice that when we're in these rooms and the more higher ranking the people become, the more higher ranking the folks are in the room, the lighter their skin gets. Now, I would argue that I was a transplant to this particular city. I think it's a whole city problem. So when I look at who's leading within the city, and even though there's a major pro-black enclave in that city, I'm like, like all of y'all are passing out brown paper bag tests, especially the higher up you go. And so, absolutely. So just noticing the opportunities, right? As you, in those professional circles, but then also just looking and being like, why am I one of few dark-skinned Black people at this level? And then in the levels beyond me, why does folks get progressively lighter and lighter? And it's interesting. I met a woman in education 10 or 12 years after she actually consulted in this district. And again, just like my colleague, without me mentioning it, we were just reminiscing about our experiences in the district. And she said the first thing that she noticed when she also went downtown to consult in the district, she said her first, and she's a dark-skinned Black woman as well, her first thing was, oh, y'all have a color problem. Because why is every Black person in this room, why could every Black person in this room pass the brown paper bag test, right? That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. That's not a mistake, right? That's not coincidence, especially going back to what I said, like if you're choosing from the Black population,
Exactly.
most Black people in the world are brown.
Yeah.
All the way through to what we call, blue black or jet black or whatever. Right. And so when you have this type of representation of the minority as far as the skin tone, there's something going on there. So I'll stop there. I have a couple more examples, but I just want to check in with you to stop and see about the
No, I think that those are such classic kinds of examples, right? When we talk about colorism and hiring, income, wealth, it's not just hiring, but also promotion, and how one, your income and your wealth is determined by your ability to get hired, and then your promotion throughout your career trajectory. And I am, going to say hello to a few folks watching really quickly. If
I
you do
see
have any
them.
questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I am joined here by Akosua, and we're talking about colorism and hiring, income, wages. Hello to Zephrine from Denver. We have Elizabeth from Tennessee, Nicole from Brooklyn, and we have Joseph from the UK. Toronto via the UK. So we got an international audience here.
I love Toronto. I love Toronto. I haven't been there in a long time, but I really love it. I used to go every year.
Shout outs. And so your examples about, for example, the higher you go in terms of leadership in a company or organization, the skin tone gets lighter. And so there are, research studies that say, amongst African Americans, as well as other minority groups, such as Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, and that sort of thing, that having lighter skin corresponds to higher career prestige, higher job prestige. And so the more prestigious, the more executive, the more senior levels tend to be disproportionately filled by people of color who have lighter skin tones and more European
Mhm.
phenotypes. And that
Mhm.
people with darker skin tones, again, across racial groups, are relegated, seem to be
Mhm.
relegated and disproportionately represented in more menial labor jobs. Their jobs and
Mhm.
their career paths have less prestige and less
Mhm.
status. And so, one, that correlation explains part of the wealth gap, right?
Mhm.
That pattern alone can explain why there is part of a difference in wages, income, and wealth.
Right.
But even when we look at comparable job dynamics, comparable career paths, there's
Mhm.
still a difference in wages. And, some studies talk about amongst Latinx Americans, there being a 20 to 26% difference. And then there was a study done amongst African Americans specifically that found 12 to 14% difference in wages, right? And
Mhm.
so I was saying this on a webinar yesterday, how we often talk about the gaps between white Americans and, Black Americans, for
Right.
example. And so
Right.
we can all imagine the charts and the graphs that compare white
Mhm.
American incomes to Black American, African American incomes. And what this study did is it disaggregated. So it, instead of lumping all Black people of every shade together, they sort of disaggregated it. And so they found that for African Americans with very light skin tones, that there was virtually no measurable difference in their incomes and the incomes of white Americans. And so that
Wow.
the bulk of the what we call a racial gap, the bulk of that was explained by the incomes and the wages of dark-skinned Black people specifically. And I think that's important because what I keep reiterating to people is that a lot of times we say something is a race problem. We say it's a racial disparity, when actually, if you disaggregate that demographic or that group, we're really dealing with color disparities,
Yep.
because we find the same thing. This is
So,
slightly off topic.
yeah, Ella wants to be part of the podcast,
she,
so
she is
I'm very sorry.
she is
Yeah.
co-signing. She
Yeah.
said, "Yep, listen, speak the truth. I can
Exactly. I'm
interpret
gonna put
both."
myself on mute because she's not gonna stop.
Okay. Um, but so we see a similar pattern, for example, in marriage rates. People talk about, oh, Black women are less likely to get married. But in studies that have looked at the marriage rates amongst African American women, they found that for light-skinned women, very light-skinned women, and or biracial women, that the marriage rates were equal to that of white women, right? And
Right.
that for women in the middle brown skin tone range, they were about 20% less likely to have been married. And then for women with very dark skin, it was like a 35% drop.
Right.
And so
Right.
all of these things that historically we've been explaining as like, oh, there's a racial gap, there's a
Mhm.
racial gap, there's a racial gap. More and more of the research is showing, well, actually, that racial gap is better explained through the lens of color, of colorism
Right.
specifically. So just in hearing that, do you have any initial reactions? Like, do you find those kinds of things surprising, frustrating, a little bit of both? Like, what are some of your initial reactions to that?
Zephrine, I hope I'm saying her name right. She's co-signing Ella, barking. Yes. And Ella is a jet black lab, so she's feeling it. She's feeling this conversation. Thank you, Zephrine. Yeah, no, those don't surprise me at all, because every data set that we're exposed to, around colorism, dark skinned Black girls have been seeing the pattern, right? And have been seeing
Mhm.
the pattern. So I'm not surprised by it. It's heartbreaking, right? It's heartbreaking in terms of what it says about our claims about pro Blackness and Black love, right? And I'm not saying Black love as far as romantic love necessarily, but I believe in the power of Black love. Like, Black folks have loved ourselves
Yeah.
into power and into joy and into, the Black movements,
Mm.
the uprising. It's all love, right? And so I have
That felt
experienced,
good in my
right?
soul.
Yeah. I mean, so I have experienced the power. I wouldn't be here without Black love, right?
Right.
And so when I hear these statistics which I first came to know because of experience as a dark-skinned Black girl, right? It just lets me know that we need to expand the tent of Black love.
Mm.
And we
Mhm.
need to be honest about what we mean when we say that we are pro-Black or something is pro-Black.
Yeah.
Right. And you and I have talked about, it's like, well, yeah, you might be pro light Black, right? And you also might be pro, middle brown Black. But how are you pro-Black if your actions, whether it's the people you hire, the people you date, the people who we esteem, the people who we celebrate, the people who we support in their time of need, I don't think you can claim pro-Blackness.
Mhm.
um, or I'll say it this way: your pro-Blackness really needs to be interrogated
Yeah.
if it doesn't include the Blackest among us. Right.
Mhm.
Right. But we also know where that comes from. Right. And so we know that, oftentimes folks get the elevation, they get the promotion, not because they're seen as liberators, right? But because they're seen as people who can carry the water for the white power structure. Right.
Mm.
So all this stuff of, oh, you're more intelligent. Well, do they see you as more intelligent because you're not proposing radical changes? Right. So they see you as more intelligent because you are co-signing their foolishness, which is inherently to support the white power structure. Right. Do
Mhm.
they see you as less threatening because you're not going to speak up? Because here's the thing, like, some people are comfortable, as one of my elders, Dr. Itihari Y. Torre says, some people are comfortable with their level of captivity,
Mm.
right? So some people, right? So it's a little annoying, right? I might be less likely to get married than a white woman might be, but not that much less likely. So I'll still, I'll still get married. My kid may come home from their private school, and there's something that I have to address. And so there's a level of comfort because it really is a different experience.
Mhm.
And it's a significantly different experience, right? And so I just think that those things go hand in hand when we talk about really interrogating our pro-Blackness, our claims of pro-Blackness, and really interrogating how wide the tent of Black love really is, right?
Mm.
But
Yeah.
then also, you know, are you carrying water for the white power structure? you
Mhm.
know and I have two examples, if I can, very quickly. I don't know how much
Yeah.
time we have. Yeah.
Oh, you
So
good. It's only 4:22. You good.
okay, all right. And so so one example is, I had been the first leader at my level in a particular department, right, at another
Mhm.
school district. And so, I had been the first leader. I had been the first Black leader at my level, right? So in this district, there was not another Black leader on the entire floor. Now, one of
Okay.
my best friends always says, when I say district, people really don't envision the size of what I'm talking about, right?
Mm.
Right. So like, a district means that you're serving all of the schools, right? And so we're talking about tens of thousands of people.
Mhm.
And so it's a, like a whole district, right? And so I was the only Black leader on my entire floor at the district level. And I was the first Black leader, and this was in the late 2000s, right? So I was the first Black leader in that position. So when I left, they invited me. They said, well, your opinion really matters. Can we, will you help us find your replacement, right? So I sat through the hiring process and gave my input. It came down to a light-skinned Black woman and a dark-skinned Black woman. And my recommendation, given what I knew, because this person had to interact with lots of people, they had to interact with principals, they had to interact with teachers, they had to interact with parents. And so, given what I knew about the job, I just really wasn't feeling the particular light-skinned Black woman as far as how she came across, as relatability, et cetera, et cetera. So I very strongly and clearly said, this other person is my choice for this, because she has the skill set, she has the temperament, she has the experience, and most importantly, because the last thing you want to do at the district level is be sending people down from the district who are just going to be aggravating and you know what I mean, standoffish and make the job of the principal and teach. It's like, anyway, she was not demonstrating that she had that level of relatability. Whereas the other candidate was like hands down, and even her experience said it. So I put in my vote very strongly. I later found out that they offered the job to the light-skinned Black woman. And the dark-skinned Black woman ended up getting the job, but only because the light-skinned Black woman turned it down. Because when she went back to her job counter offered her when they found out that she was leaving. Right.
Gotcha.
There's a lot in that scenario, isn't there? Like there's a lot of meat in that scenario. But but why were they more comfortable with her? Why were they more comfortable with her? And again, my interpretation, a little cool, a little more standoffish, but she was a lot more like them. She, because what comes with one thing that comes with me being so engaged is also when I see something, I'm going to call it out. And so, anyway, so that's just kind of one example of another story, but also going back to the data, right? And what's one reason that the data is what it is because not only are people benefiting from the stereotype that lighter-skinned Black people are more intelligent and more relatable and, represent us better. My question is, if you're claiming pro-Blackness, are you interrogating whether you're being used to carry the water of the white power structure?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's about that. We know this person won't speak up. We know this person is not threatening. We know, or believe, because that's not true for all light-skinned folks, right? But at least we believe, right, that they're closer to one of us and won't challenge us and will help us keep the white power structure in place.
And so this is also not something I had planned to say, but your comments are bringing me here because like I said, I did a webinar yesterday, and part of it was specifically for Black History Month. And so one of the things I brought out was how it was well documented that whites during slavery, during the period of slavery in the United States, like white people really did believe that mixed race people were more likely to be their allies, right? Like they literally felt safer around them, as if like, oh, okay, well, they're less likely to have a revolt or like have an uprising. And so I'm like hearing you say that, like there is historical context to that notion, to that belief and that perception. And I'm also thinking about, for light-skinned people who find themselves in these positions, you actually have more freedom to be on the cutting edge, on the leading edge, right? Precisely because they don't expect it. Whereas like someone who is darker skinned might be under a microscope, might be facing that much more scrutiny and, research has shown are more likely to be disciplined for really small infractions that a lighter skinned person is not disciplined for, is not punished for in the same way. And so I think then comes a responsibility to that, precisely because you are in their perspective more trustworthy. And so then because you are given that space and given that I guess benefit of the doubt, right? Like you have that much more responsibility to exercise your Black love in that space.
Yeah. And I found that given the level of comfort with the captivity, right? Not only have I found that my lighter skinned colleagues don't always use that power because they're not interested. They're interested in keeping their job. Right. And so, and again, I'm not talking about all light skin. I'm talking about some light skinned colleagues that I've had. Right.
Yeah.
And so, and I'll stop here for a moment. Elizabeth Upshur, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. She wanted to know who I was quoting. Some people are comfortable with their level of captivity. Her name is Dr. Itihari, Itihari, initial Y, Toure, Toure. She's one of my very beloved and esteemed Black women education elders. But there, and so there's a level, there is more power. And there's apps, I have found that there are most times absolutely no interest in using it to disrupt their level of comfort and to
Mhm.
disrupt their prized and privileged position within the organization. Uh, in fact, not only has there not been, is not any interest, I have had colleagues and people in spaces where we're working or going to school who will actually throw me under the bus
Mhm.
to ensure, right, that they put the proper distance between
Gotcha.
me
Yeah.
and them.
Mhm.
Um, and but what's curious about these things is that, because I do have a strong voice, right, and because I will speak up, they're okay with me speaking up about things that they're not comfortable with, right? So they're okay with me being your shield when I
Mhm.
speak up about something that impacts their level of comfort. But when I go too far, because of course they get to determine who and when goes too far. Goes too far means it's now impacting something that's making me uncomfortable, but it's not impacting your level of comfort. So you actually are not in solidarity with me, right? You jump on my bandwagon when I speak up about something that you want addressed.
Yeah.
But because we're having a different experience, and there are things that I need to have addressed that are not impacting you in this organization because of colorism, then they shrink back, right? They go back into their, oh no, I'm the safe one. Well, Akosawa, she,
Mhm.
and it's like this, and until I realize, like, you're using me. And we don't, we don't, we're not here. You're not in solidarity. You're not necessarily all the way pro-black, but you are using me sort of like as a shield at
Mhm.
your, you tap into blackness um when it benefits you. And so that has
And
been
that's
another
pain that's like you said, that is heartbreaking, right? And
that's
that is
heartbreaking.
one of the many forms of betrayal
Hmm.
that exists among us, and I think that those kinds of betrayals have to be reckoned with and reconciled in order for us to move forward in the unity that we profess,
Right.
right? And I think there is so much conversation around Black unity, and I think one of the questions I was going to ask you is, what do you say to people who claim conversations around colorism are creating division, and you're don't let them divide us? I was like, but
Girl,
they already did that. They
yeah, girl.
already did that. And
Right,
so
right.
just because I'm talking about it doesn't mean I'm creating the division. But also what I tell people is that, we say, oh, talking about colorism is undermining Black unity. I'm like, no, there is no Black unity if we cannot acknowledge and hold each other accountable for the colorism we perpetuate
Right.
amongst ourselves.
Right. Yeah,
I want
child,
to look
I don't talk to them people.
at
I don't, because it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's like,
yes.
thank you for sharing.
Hmm.
And now I know, now I know who I can do this work, because you can't build with everybody,
This
right?
is
And
true.
now I'm clear about
That's
who you
true.
are and the extent of your pro-blackness. And God bless you and have a wonderful day.
I love it. I love it. And
It's
I
it's
think that
foolishness, child. It's foolish. That's foolish.
identifying the people that you can actually build with, I think,
Mhm.
is a practical strategy in terms
It
of
is.
undoing these things. I do want to look at Zephrine's earlier comment. How do we address? I don't know if Zephrine is still watching, but it'll be on recorded. So, how do
Mhm.
we address level of comfort in ourselves? And I'm assuming I shouldn't assume. So Zephrine, if you are still watching and you want to clarify that, but based on like my initial reaction or initial interpretation of that question is for those of us who have internalized, right? The racist ideas, the racist narratives, like how do we choose to show up? We're talking about the workspace, but really how do we choose to show up in our lives in a
Mhm.
way that is unapologetic, that is not constantly apologizing for being the darker skinned person in the
Mhm.
district, right? Or being the
Mhm.
only dark
Mhm.
skinned person at the executive level.
Mhm.
Um, what could you speak to that? Because I think some people might look at you and like how you present and be like, well, she, yes, has experienced colorism in the workplace, but it hasn't like made her shrink, right? You still seem very comfortable in yourself, even with all the experiences you've mentioned. So do you have anything to say towards that?
Yeah. Save your money and be prepared to leave.
Mm.
Right? And because people will look and be like, oh my gosh, well, you have your own organization. Well, I have my own organization because there was not a pathway
Mm.
forward. You know,
Mm.
there, yeah, and so a pathway forward, meaning I am unapologetically for the liberation of Black school children through education.
Gotcha.
There's a lot of foolishness happening in these districts.
Mhm.
And while white folks are perpetuating it and exploiting it, exploiting their position, exploiting their power, getting the jobs, paying themselves and their friends much more than the Black folks are paying, there are Black folks who are in on the foolishness as well.
There are. Mhm.
And so there was not a path forward for me because, my former pastor passed away, but he used to say, Black people have three enemies: the devil, white people, and Black people. Right? So what the devil doesn't do to you, white folks are definitely gonna try to do. And what white people don't come along and do, it's those folks who are comfortable in their captivity who are going to come
Mhm.
along and say, oh, no, 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 no. She's messing up
Mm.
my gravy train. Right? That's only something that we whisper about quietly, but we don't
Yeah,
stand up
yeah.
to the district. We don't
Gotcha.
stand up to the
Yeah.
powers that be. We don't speak truth to power because we will be fired or we will be demoted or we will not get those promotions. And they are absolutely right.
Mhm.
They're right. They're
So
absolutely right.
Zephrine clarified, thank you, says, I am unpacking
Hmm.
years of being a good one. Gotcha. And so feeling comfortable being the token, basically,
Right.
right?
Right.
How do we shake our, if so, I still think everything you said stands in terms of like preparing yourself to carve out your own path. And like
Mhm.
that speaks directly to my experience, right? Like
Right.
literally I saved my money so I could get up
Yep.
out of that
Right.
university.
Right.
Hope,
And carve out.
hoping.
So, and two things came to mind: carve out your own path and your money so you can leave, and also prepare to sue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But
Because
for those
because these
who,
things that are happening are absolute violations of civil rights.
yeah.
And so, put yourself in a position, because some people don't sue because they get a severance, right, and then they get this non-disclosure agreement. But if you
Mm,
can position yourself to sue, because it's they're violations of civil rights. And I know
gotcha.
that's not really the answer that people maybe wanted to hear. I know it may not be a practical answer. Um, but that's where you hear and see my confidence.
Okay. That's real. Thank
Because
you.
there was no path forward for me.
Yeah.
There wasn't a path forward.
And so hearing that side of it, it sounds like that's like for us who were very uncomfortable, right? Like I was very uncomfortable there. I was not happy. I was not one of the good ones. I had been alienated by the time I left there, right? And so
Mhm.
it seems like maybe a little easier than to be like, okay, I'm deuces because they don't want me here anyway, and I don't like it. But now for those of us who
Mhm.
are the good ones, who are like accepted in and
Mhm.
seen as one of the good ones, how can we, and I'm asking this question not necessarily to you because I'm
Right.
also thinking about it.
Yeah.
How can we, rattle ourselves out of that complacency or that like kind of just level of being comfortable?
Yeah. Um I can only speak from the stand. I really appreciate that question, Zephrine. And I love your name too. I can only speak from the standpoint of someone who has been impacted by the betrayal of the good ones and
Mm,
hope that that insight helps. Um, you know, you so couple things. One, people have to eat. right? So I am not at all saying like if being one of the good ones for a time period, right, like helps you pay that tuition, helps you, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not, people have to eat. I'm not impractical in that way. Um, but can you use at least some of that to
Mm.
get a tangible result for the
Mm.
folks who don't have the benefit of that, right?
Gotcha.
So I would say, one, be honest and don't play both sides of the fence, right? And that's from my standpoint, because now you're using me, right? So don't be all in the coffee room talk about, oh yeah, girl, and meanwhile, my neck is the only one that's on the line, right? So I would just
Mm.
say, be honest, because people can sense inauthenticity and nobody likes to be used, right? But
Mhm.
so that's my first thing. I would say my Ella is hiding under the couch. She's really mad and I'm not paying attention to her right now.
Sorry,
Uh,
Ella.
she literally just climbed under the couch. Um, but then secondly, use your power, because you do have a disproportionate amount of power and you do have a different level of comfort, to get some tangible result. And when I say tangible result, I'm talking about a raise. If you know that you're being paid more than somebody who is as qualified, or in many cases more qualified, right? A raise, right? Something that is something tangible, and you have to assess the risk, right? But don't
Yeah.
just be
Yeah.
coming in the coffee room talking about, oh girl, yeah, I see how they're treating you, and then because I need to eat too, right? I
Mhm.
need to build wealth too, and I deserve to have that opportunity. As a kind of non-example, there was a light-skinned sister who I was, in this particular professional setting with, and I had noted to her, I was like, oh, there's this particular fellowship opportunity, but I'm noticing that they've only offered it to light-skinned Black folks or white-skinned Latinx folks, right? In since I've been here. And she blew it off. Oh, well, that's just so and so, blah, blah, blah. But then later in the conversation, she's like, yeah, they offered it to me last year. Sis. Right. So again, you all pro-Black, but only when it's something that doesn't impact you. Right.
Mhm.
So since they offered it to you last year, since you're apparently in, right, do something tangible and go to them and say, I need to see more skin color diversity in this fellowship opportunity. Don't sit and look at me, because it was just because you was all bold about, because it didn't impact you, it's not a big deal.
Right.
Well, who knows, professionally or as far as wealth or opportunities, how that opportunity would help someone else along the way, even though you blew it off as, I don't
So
know if
I
that's
like
helpful. Yeah.
no, I like the point one, to start from the foundation, is be honest about where you are. And I do like the the real practical example of people have to eat, but also, like, as Black people who have any number of traumas to deal with,
Mhm.
like, it's okay to strive for comfort, right? But again, like, if that is your goal, be like, look, I'm one of us that's just trying to get comfortable. I ain't for the revolution, right? And I
Right.
think, own that. Like, stand
Own
in
it.
that. Like, if you're
Right.
like, if you not trying to be a revolutionary, if you're not trying to be a trailblazer, if you're not trying to be at the helm of any sort of social justice movement, broadly speaking, or just narrowly focused in your local environment, I think be honest about that. And then, like you said, recognize your season.
Mhm.
Recognize what season you're in. Because
Yep.
I do think like, it's helpful to realize that we can't always be fighting. Some of us
Right.
have to, out of
Yeah.
necessity, right?
Right.
Um, but I think allowing yourself to take advantage of those creature comforts when they come along, as a period of rejuvenation,
Yeah.
like you said, like, maybe I'm the good one because I got to stack these coins, and then I'm gonna throw up
Yep.
my deuces and go start something else and be radical AF, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Or
but
you
I
may
think
have children or elderly people, depending, like,
you might be physically sick for a time, and you're like,
right,
look, I'm just gonna
right,
coast. for the next
Right.
5 years while I get over this illness or while I, recuperate or
Mhm.
recover from whatever. And so
Mhm.
I think the intentionality is important in that
Mhm.
case, right? And not um, fooling yourself, not lying
Right.
to yourself about saying, "Oh, I got my foot in the door, and so I can be of service," when you're not actually being of service.
Right.
But I
Right.
think the use your position to get tangible results too. So for
Mhm.
those Black folks who are saying like, "Oh, I'm going to um, get in the door and create all these opportunities for other Black people." I think that like is a theoretical thing, but you have to ask yourself like, okay, how many more Black people have been hired at this company since I started working here?
Right.
Since I got this promotion, how many Black people have I offered internships to? How many
Yep.
other dark-skinned Black people, regardless of what color you are, how many
Right.
dark-skinned Black people have I, advocated for promotions or advocated for
Right.
raises or recommended for like programs, special programs, or to like
Mhm. Mhm.
lead a special project, right?
Mhm.
And the third thing that I'll add is that we don't always have to know that you're doing that. And so there's debate about that because if we don't know you're doing it, then you can be
Right.
accused of not doing anything.
Right.
But also,
Right.
it
Right.
can be performative too, right? Like, oh, look, I'm coming over here to like help this poor, needy, dark skinned woman who
Right.
couldn't
Right.
possibly make it without me, right?
Right.
And so we don't want to
Right.
have like a light skinned savior complex or anything like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, like for yourself, keep a log if you're really trying to be subversive. Because I do believe in subversion. I do
Yeah.
believe that
Absolutely.
subversiveness is a thing, and
Yep.
that Black people are masters of dissemblance. I love the word
Yes.
dissemblance. Like we
Yes.
have just like nobody else in the world. We
Yes.
can make something look like one thing and have it be
Mhm.
something totally different. And that's a matter
Yes.
of survival, right? On the
Yep.
plantation,
Yep.
we wanted to make fun of the white slave owner, and we could not let him know we was making fun of him or we would have been lynched, right? And
Right.
so like
Right.
literally for our lives, we had to
Yeah.
learn how to plan escape routes, right? Like
Yep.
literally travel across the country by foot without
Yes.
anybody finding out. And so I
Yep.
do believe subversion is possible, but I
Mhm.
also agree with you in that a lot of times people tell themselves that that's what they're doing, but
Right.
they aren't collecting their receipts, right?
Right.
So collecting
Right.
your like if you're in a space to be
Mhm.
subversive, make sure you have your receipts for yourself first of all, because we
Right.
don't want to be lying and deluding ourselves.
Right. Right. And and also, I would say to this point too, while you're figuring it out, at the very least, stay out of my way. Don't,
Mm,
I don't need you jumping on my bandwagon and then jumping off when it matters. You know what I'm saying? So at the very least, just Okosawa, like stay out, like just stay out of my way.
right.
Just stay out of my way because it, yeah. I mean, I've talked to you about the results of when folks don't do that. Like if you're not sure and if you're not confident to see it through, this is not a bandwagon for me. I don't need anybody to ride along. I've been defending myself, since I was a kid, unfortunately. Right. So, stay out of my way and definitely don't jump in on the end when there's some benefit for you.
Yeah. And I
When,
think
when I've
people
done when I've done all the heavy lifting, and then now you want to say you're associated because I won the fight that I waged.
yeah. I hear people say, because my argument is always that it takes everybody to do something in order to end colorism and whatever the problem is in the world, like the people marginalized by it did not create that problem, and yet we're
Mhm.
expected to be the ones to solve it. And
Mhm.
so yes, like dark skinned people, dark skinned women should be centered in the conversation around colorism, but we can't be the only ones working to end it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like we need
Mhm.
all hands on deck to really rectify this problem. And so
Mhm.
I think in looking at where it's safe for you, like where are you feeling safe? Are you feel comfortable? Um, it goes back to your notion of Black love, right?
Mhm.
Like, do you love your level of comfort? or do you actually love Black people? And I think
All
that's
right.
something, a question you have to answer for yourselves. Like, which one do I love more? Like my comfort, or do I love my people? And even on a more like micro scale, for example,
Mhm,
showing up to do these live streams,
mhm,
creating content around issues that we care about, right? Like that is
mhm.
costing us something.
Yeah,
Um, but I love my people more
right,
than I hate the trolls.
right.
I love my people more than I hate the grunt work of creating graphics and, scheduling
Exactly.
live streams, right? So
Mhm,
like I'm
mhm,
willing to pay that, like give that up
mhm,
because of the degree to which I love something else. And so I always tell people it's like when the scale tips for you, where like your love for Black people and our liberation outweighs, the appeal of
mhm,
cushiony jobs, or
mhm,
the appeal
mhm.
of like what do you call that? Uh blending into the culture.
Yeah, assimilation
Assimilation.
or yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
More
yeah,
like so when, love for Black people appeals to you more than assimilation does. Like
right.
it's just like a tipping of the scale. And I
Yeah,
think feeding the love for Black folks and seeing us fully liberated will help you tip that scale in that direction.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and this whole conversation also makes me think of another example. Do I have time to share?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
so
and then we'll take final questions. So if you have any last thoughts or comments
okay,
for Akosa or for either of us,
right.
start putting those in the chat.
Because sometimes, you may not know, right, that you're being, as one of the good ones, lighter ones, more palatable ones, et cetera, et cetera. You may not know that you're being used against a darker skinned Black person, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, but you have to trust us because we know,
Mhm.
right? You have to. I've worked at several, yet another school district at the district level. Um,
Yes, you're freezing up a little bit.
okay. So at another school district, at the district level, my division leader was putting out a like advertisement thing about the work that we were doing in our division. And she used a pretty problematic reference. So it wasn't like egregiously anti-Black, but if you know anything about history, if I was like, this is not going to look good, especially coming from a white leader of this department in a Black school district, in a Black and Latinx school district. This language is anti-Black, right? Right.
Mhm.
And, there was another person, a lighter skinned Black woman at a higher level than I was, and even higher than my boss. And she said, so she was defensive at first. I mean, I finally brought her enough evidence to tell her like that particular phrasing is absolutely rooted in anti-Blackness, even though it's become a common American phrase. And her defense, and I could tell she was being defensive initially. Well, let's call her name Sylvia. Well, I ran it past Sylvia, and Sylvia didn't say anything. What's happening there? Now it's
Sylvia's
possible. Go ahead.
Sylvia's word has more value and validity than yours.
Right. And and we also know that it's a game though, right? She just wanted her way. But just
Mhm.
also understanding that that the folks in this white power structure will use us against each other, and it
Yeah.
often happens on color lines,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so even if you don't know that you're not being used against someone else who is darker or seen as more radical, to trust us when we say that it happens a lot. Trust us when we say that it happens a lot. And so, so again, part of that acceptance is because you can, even without knowing it, be used to carry the water of the white power structure.
Mm.
Now, I don't think she ended up using it because I brought all time, but it was like, but again, in that moment, Sylvia's word or she wanted to present it as, because it's
Right.
a game. It's a
Yeah.
game, right? But she knew she could reach for that.
Right.
Because there are other times where she absolutely disregarded Sylvia's authority when she
Yes.
wanted to,
Of course.
right?
Right.
But just as another example of how these things happen, all in service of the white power structure.
Yeah. All right. So I don't see any other additional questions or comments in the chat, but I do want to thank everyone for tuning in today, whether you're watching live or watching the playback. And I will be back next week with a new special guest to talk about colorism and company culture, and really looking at what companies, organizations, institutions, schools, what groups of people can do to, one, recognize where colorism might be impacting their culture, and then two, intervening if it is impacting their culture, and also preventing. So I'm a proponent of interventions and preventions. Like, so when it's happening, intervene, but also create an ecosystem where it's less likely to happen in the first place. So we'll be looking at company culture specifically. And I think that's going to be an important one in terms of continuing this conversation, a coastal of, if we're in a company, what are we saying and signaling, and how are we showing up as the Black people in that company, right? Or as the, Latinx people in that company, or the Asian people in that company. Like, do we understand each other? Despite what the white power structure is trying to do, like, how are we, just like our ancestors did, literally just like our ancestors did on plantations for generations, right? They existed in an even more violent and domineering white power structure than we do. And yet they still found ways to get their signal from one to the other, right? Like, I can communicate with you in this very harmful, toxic, violent, dangerous space, and we can get something done. We can get the job done.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So,
some didn't, right?
some,
You know, right.
you're
And
right.
so
You're right.
it was right, and
Yes.
it was the ones who still had
Correct.
to run it, who had to run and tell master, right?
Correct.
That like, oh, they planning on escaping,
Correct.
but
Yes.
to your point, we can't be willfully ignorant about the fact that no matter these stratifications between us, they still see us as a body of people in this organization, and how you show up impacts the entire body, right? So if you're showing up and you're disparaging this side of the body, that that's going to be the impact. And so don't move with ignorance around that. Even if you never talk to the Black girl on the 5th floor, understand that how you move and how you show up is going to impact the Black girl on the 5th floor. And I'm looking at Joseph's statements. He says the pressure of these dynamics are crazy. Other folks can just turn up for work. The balance of love versus survival cannot be understated. Right. And that's really powerful. And but we have models for that. And one is to get rid of this willful ignorance that I just happen to be another Black person in this organization. No, sis, you're still a unit. You're still a unit. And take responsibility for how the way you show up absolutely has ripple effects in tangible ways to Black folks, all the way, custodians, your secretary, every Black person in that building, because our destinies are intertwined. So at the very least, don't be willfully ignorant about that.
Yeah. All right. So you, I think, have just been bringing so many nuggets and so many insights, so many like truths and truth bombs, truth gems, truth sprinkles, sparkles our way. And I'm sure that the people who are watching might be curious to follow up with you, maybe continue to follow your work, or, reach out for consultations or conversations or whatever the case may be. If they just want to be able to reach out again, how can they do that?
Absolutely. So I am very responsive on Instagram and also via email. So if you want to talk more about colorism, again, I'm not the expert. Dr. Webb is the expert. But I did start my Instagram page at Dark Women and Girls 365. And it really is my personal journey. So I talk the same way I'm talking to Dr. Webb. It's a part of my healing journey to break my silence about my experiences of colorism. And then if you are interested in the work I do with Black women educators and what I call Black pedagogical genius, then hit me up at Seek Retreat, at SIEC Retreat. And at Seek Retreat, it's at Seek Retreat on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all those things. But you can really hit me up on either one about either topic, and I'd be happy to converse with you.
Yes. Well, so first of all, I want to thank you for engaging. I want to thank the audience for listening to this conversation because Okosawa, that a huge part of the hurdle is just getting people to pay attention, just
Yeah.
getting people to care enough to say, "Oh, colorism, let me go listen and see what they're
Right.
talking about." So
Right.
that alone is doing the work. Like
Mm-hmm.
the fact that the folks who are watching and that you and like the people who continue to, find your work and my work,
Mm-hmm.
like, I just want to say I acknowledge anyone who just clicks on the link
Yes.
and doesn't just scroll past when
Yes.
they see
Absolutely.
colorism. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Like,
Yes.
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
thank you.
It's a big deal.
It is. But
Yeah. Yeah.
also, saying that though, don't let this be the last time you talk about colorism. Don't let this be the last time you engage on the conversation, whether it's with me, on through my work on colorism healing, whether it's with Akosawa or some other platform, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe we're not your cup of tea. That's
Yes.
fine. But don't let us and our style of delivery be the reason you never talk about colorism again. Like
Right.
go
Right.
and find the platform or the resource that resonates with you and continue the conversation. But if you do like my vibe, I'll be back next week, Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay. And in the meantime, I hope you all have a good evening and a great weekend and take care.
Take
Bye.
care, everybody.